So this is really a great occasion, not only because of the honoree, but it's the first time many of us have been able to gather in groups of bigger than 2 in over a year and a half. So we hope it's not a super spreader event. We worked hard to minimize that risk, right? But vaccinations are available as you leave the building. Yeah, boosters are available as you leave the building, right? You didn't get that part of the notice. Well, all right. Anyway, so I have the honor of presiding over the last panel as to what's been a very rich, full day. And we end on a very rich, full panel. So this is really quite a feast, and it reflects just how great the organizer has done in pulling together this event, my colleague. And so without further ado, Lucian.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Delighted to be here. If this turns out to be a super spreader event, I cannot think about a nicer group and company to do it with. So I'll talk about stakeholders and the ownership of enterprise, touching some of the stakeholder issues that have already come up. Okay, just to say a few words about my own encounter with Henry's work. And people mentioned reading the book and being influenced by it at various places. I'm one of the people old enough who had the opportunity to be influenced by the articles that later on made it into the book. And for me, the role of the nonprofit enterprise, which was one of the few articles that Victor Bradley, my teacher, gave me to read when I was getting into academic work in this area. And then the ownership of enterprise that formed the core of the thesis of the book. They were both inspirational for me as well as a model for work in this area. Now, the ownership of enterprise does discuss the subject of stakeholders. As you all know, was discussed many times today. Henry talks about not using the term stakeholders, but the term patrons. You have a group, you have different groups of patrons, what in today's discourse we'll refer to as stakeholders. And the question for him is who should own, quote unquote, the firm? And for him, the owners are those that, one, hold the formal control rights, and two, serve as the residual claimants. And he considers and rejects as ill-functioning the possibility of having the firm owned by all stakeholders. He says that in theory, in this passage that I have here, in theory, we could have all of them there, but this would increase the cost of collective decision-making enormously. But some version of looking at all stakeholders is back and has massive support. And the rising support for what I call stakeholder governance. In our work, we use the shorthand, quote unquote, stakeholderism. That view accepts Henry's assumption that in investor-owned companies, in public companies, the shareholders should be exclusively the ones with formal control rights. But that view questions the Hansmann thesis that formal control rights should go together with status as residual claimants, and that it should go to whoever has the formal control rights. And the support is for what I would call here the stakeholderist firm that is investor-owned in the Henry sense, that the shareholders are the only ones that have control rights, but it's stakeholder-oriented in the sense that corporate leaders are supposed to serve the interest of all stakeholders and not only shareholders. And the question that let's ask ourselves is, in the spirit of Henry Hansmann's work, whether this particular firm, which is not part of the animals that he as a biologist was looking for and cataloging, can this stakeholderist firm be well-functioning, efficient, socially desirable? And it's an important question because there is a rising support for it. As you know, the Business Roundtable, the Davos Stakeholder Capitalism Manifesto, and so forth and so on. And stakeholderism supporters make two claims. They make the normative claim that this is the direction that public companies should be going. And also they make positive claims in the spirit of Henry's work that this is already happening, that corporate leaders are increasingly acting in accordance with what a stakeholderist firm should be doing. In a line of work that we have been doing, and this is, there are 4 current articles and some other works and some other pieces in the works. Some of those are with Roberto Talarita, who is here, and some of them are the two of us together with Kobe Castiel. And a few words about the direction from which we are coming. So we do share, and Oliver talked during lunch about the fact that what has changed in the last 25 years, that some people were concerned about stakeholders, but the level of concern about stakeholders, and especially about the problems of climate change, the level and the urgency of concerns has been rising. In the words of Rebecca Henderson, capitalism needs to adjust to a world on fire, quote unquote. And not everyone, but we personally share very much this concern. We think it deserves, it is a first order social concern, and we consider ourselves friends of stakeholder interests. Let me say, therefore, what we would like to see. So here, let me side with Henry, which is always good to do, but also especially in this event. So Henry said that he would like to see, earlier in the day, he said he would like to see the government fix those problems and not rely on corporations or their leaders. And that's very much our view. We would like to see, given what we think about the existing problems, we think that we need substantial expansion of measures to protect stakeholders, and in particular, in the current context of climate change, which is on the mind of many people, it's important to have, as soon as possible, substantial measures that would adopt taxes on emissions-producing activities and provide subsidies for emission-reducing activities. So let me say something before I move into the substance about, and this is connected to Luigi, said something in an earlier session that might lead some people to think that we, or at least I, are kind of pro-shareholders types of guys, and that this is a clash between stakeholders and shareholders, and we are siding with the shareholders because we are pro-shareholders types of guys. So I want to clarify this, that this is very much not the case. From my own perspective, I don't have particular interest in maximizing the interest or payoffs of shareholders. I think about the corporations as a social institution, and we would like to design it in the way that would be most value enhancing for society. And the work I've done over the years is less kind of shareholder focused, as kind of concerned about problems that come from insiders extracting rents, and in the course of this also leading to a distorted decision-making that hurts value that is being created in society. So in the public, this widely held company, the remedy is shareholder rights. So there, it's because of the skepticism about managers, it leads one to take a pro quote unquote shareholder positions, but that's not in order to benefit the shareholders. That's because that's the best mechanism of accountability for managers. The work that I've done over the years on controlling shareholders is, if anything, work that usually advocated stronger rules that try to constrain rent seeking by controlling shareholders. So there, it's definitely not a pro-shareholder view. Returning to our general view, we think that it's not a question, and we shouldn't be thinking about this as shareholders versus stakeholders. From my perspective, and I think my co-authors think so too, if there were any measures, given how we think about the severity of the current problem, that would make stakeholders better off, we think that society should move substantially in that direction. So our main view here is that it's not stakeholders versus shareholders, but it's really in the contemporary debate in the US, is managers against everyone else, stakeholders, shareholders, and society. And managers trying to ride the ESG wave for interests that I will presently discuss. Let me skip, we kind of discuss different versions of stakeholderism, but let me go in the interest of time. Our main concern about the stakeholderism view and the claims that it makes is that it doesn't really engage with the first order incentives problem. And our analysis of the array of incentives that corporate leaders face and the markets within which they operate indicates that corporate leaders have incentives not to serve stakeholder interests beyond what would serve shareholder value and sometimes their value. And that's in very much the heart of what the piece on the illusory promise argues. We also try to provide significant evidence consistent with this account of incentives to show that the massive amount of stakeholder rhetoric being expressed and engaged with by corporate leaders is mostly for show. And we show that this is the case even when corporate leaders are allowed to do it, or even when they are required to do it. Because since our conclusions are incentives grounded, we do not attach that much significance to whether to define doctrine, whether we have a duty that whether the duty allows them to do it, whether the duty requires them to do it, whether they just can use the business judgment. Well, we think that practically they can do it right now. And practically, however you tweak the rule, which we would be happy to do if it could make the world better, it's not going to make practically a lot of difference as long as the fundamental incentives is the way we find them. There's some few pieces of evidence, and they are described in the several papers that I mentioned and that are available on SSRN, most of them. One piece shows that consistent with the fact that CEOs did not think that this is an important consequential decision. The CEOs that joined the business roundtable based on survey that we conducted, asking all the public companies that joined, CEOs generally did not obtain board approval either ex ante or ex post to their joining the statement. We also have in another subsequent piece, will corporations deliver value to all stakeholders? We have a number, we look at a wide array of subsequent corporate documents, and we find all kinds of things that are all consistent with the mostly for show view. For example, statements by numerous companies in subsequent security filings in response to shareholder proposals that they do not expect or plan any changes given their endorsement of a commitment which was described by the Business Roundtable and many of the CEOs at the time as historic and a major milestone. And we have other pieces like the fact that most of the companies that actually updated, so they explicitly looked at the wording of the corporate governance guidelines, left explicit commitments to shareholder primacy, and that universally all the companies have director compensation arrangements which not only shape incentives but also reinforce and send a message as to what the directors are supposed to serve. All of them have substantial tie to stakeholder price, and none of them has any tie to a stakeholder metric. In a piece that looks more at actual economically consequential decisions, titled "For Whom Corporate Leaders Bargain," we look at all the deals in the last 20 years in which public companies were sold to private equity buyers, which are known often to reduce employment. And we looked at the setting which is most conducive for stakeholder-based actions if corporate leaders were inclined to take them, which is when the transactions were governed by state constituency statutes, which either allowed or even in some few cases require taking stakeholders into account. And when we analyze in detail all the deal terms, we find that corporate leaders generally obtained a lot of benefits for shareholders, very often also benefits for themselves, but generally there were no protections negotiated for the employees or for other stakeholders. And lastly, in a paper that we are finishing these days, will be circulated next month, we put stakeholder capitalism to a test by looking at the terms of deals concluded during the pandemic. We think that the pandemic provides a good test because it came right after the Business Roundtable, the Davos Manifesto, kind of a whole chorus of pledges and commitments to stakeholderism. The pandemic was a period in which concerns about stakeholders and their vulnerability were especially elevated. And lastly, if you just Google it, you'll find that the pandemic was accompanied by numerous pledges and statements by companies and their advisors that the companies are really looking after the interests of the stakeholders. Okay, so what we find is there are actually a lot of deals. We find 100 acquisitions with more than 1 billion value each, total of more than 600 billion, so it's economically significant space. We find, again, substantial gains to the shareholders, substantial gains to the corporate leaders, but generally, we don't find any incidence of material protection for stakeholder interest, employees, or anyone else. Some of you might say, if the problem is rooted in incentives, maybe it can be solved, and maybe it's all in the process of being solved by having ESG-based metrics. So we have another paper in which we look at all the S&P 500 100 companies. Half of them already have some ESG metrics. And we ask, would the world be better if all of them adopted such metrics? And we find one that usually the metrics are very narrow slice. So we have the Bent-Holmstrom problem of multitasking. But more importantly, if you think about the agency problems and the progress we have made in overseeing executive compensation in the last 2-3 decades, you see that those compensation measures actually are a step in the wrong direction, because generally they are designed in such a way that it's very difficult for outsiders to review what's going on, and they seem to be more designed to increase the payoffs of corporate leaders and are unlikely to provide any meaningful incentives. So to return to the question or to the comment that John Amos said this morning, he was saying, look, but if we are not certain about what the government will do, and we are not sure the government will solve everything by 2050, we should put some of our weight on action on the corporate sector. And our conclusions from the evidence we have accumulated, that whatever you think about the government health, that's really the only hope and the only game in town. That if you place hopes on what corporations will do, then, and if that's what we are counting on, then by the 50th anniversary of Henry's book, which I'm sure all of us will be here to celebrate in 2046, the problem of rising sea levels in Manhattan is going to be very severe, because we think, based on this evidence, that the likelihood that what companies will do on their own will be largely rhetoric and will not move the needle is very large. But some of you might say, maybe stakeholderism cannot hurt, maybe it won't move things much, but it can't hurt, maybe it will just move us in a positive direction. And we argue that that's not the case, that stakeholderism would be counterproductive because it would produce two major costs. One is reduced accountability, a main reason why some corporate leaders and advisors are attracted to stakeholderism, because that provides them a main reason to urge institutional investors to be more deferential to corporate leaders, more accepting of arrangements that insulate management from market pressures. And this effect would just increase the cost of collective decision-making that Henry highlighted. It would benefit the private interest of managers, but not those of either shareholders or stakeholders. The second problem, the second cost of acceptance of stakeholderism, is that it might chill stakeholder-oriented reforms. That acceptance of stakeholderism raises illusory hopes that corporate leaders would protect stakeholders on their own, and that this might chill or impede efforts to obtain regulatory reform that could produce real benefits and are really the only avenue to do it. So the last thing that I'll say is that what our work indicates is that stakeholderism and the advocacy for stakeholderist firms is really managerialism in new clothes. It seeks to take us back to the managerial era, not to move us forward. And the stakeholderist firm is merely, to use Henry's vocabulary and framework, is merely an investor-owned firm with greater agency problems, higher cost of collective decision-making, and vis-a-vis society at large, a false promise and a distracting promise to alleviate corporate externality. My time is up. Thank you very much, Jeff, for the reminders.
Okay.
No.
Yeah. So we have 10 minutes for Q&A, and Zohar, you get the first one.
Thank you, Lucian. So without disagreeing with the theory, I just want to make one comment on the empirical studies that supports the theory. All of the facts are from the last 20 years. The last 20 years.
Not the corona, that's from the last year and a half.
Okay, it's still the last 20 years. Even the corona gets into the last 20 years. And the last 20 years, we know that's the era where we got the hedge fund activism. So you're testing something in an environment where still shareholder primacy is the leading drive with all the forces of accountability that are working there. So if you want to test your theory, you should go to the 60s and the 70s when you said there was managerialism, and then to show whether there we didn't see the response that people are saying we should expect during if we will adopt a stakeholders view.
Okay. So you are saying, look, by the way, that's exactly what corporate leaders say. They say, look, you want us to help stakeholders. They say we are already helping stakeholders a great deal. But if you want us to do even more, you should impede those pesky activists, and you should do all kinds of other things and insulate us even more than we are. And then don't worry, in 10 or 20 years, we'll fix our problems. So the reason why I'm skeptical is, one, they already have substantial discretion, and they're already saying, and they've been saying for several years, very, very strongly, that they are doing a lot. So if we find that they are really doing very, very little and it's only rhetorical, then, and if I have this incentive concern that I don't see why they would do more, that makes us skeptical that if we deliver for them even more insulation, it would operate to the benefit of stakeholders. The other thing, and there are some people who, for example, our friend Leo Strine is in that, but if you read some of the Bartel-Lipton memos and others, there is this nostalgia to the 50s and the 60s. They all say, let's go back to the 50s and 60s. And then we had the CEOs and there was the community and the workers were better off and so forth. And that's the story that we are given. And I think that this particular we can argue about the 50s and 60s in general, how great they are, and there is a lot of debate about this. But I don't know why you focus on the 50s and 60s. We had capitalism without activist hedge funds, as far as I know, also in the 20s and the 30s and the 10s, and Oliver is here, also in 19th century England. And at least from the novels that I read and from the movies that I've seen, from the novels I've read and the movies that I've seen about those periods, I doubt that we had a capitalism that treated stakeholders with the gentle face and the gentle treatment that we are promised that we'll get if we shut down activists. And if we could get it by shutting down activists, I'll be happy to do it. But for the reasons I explained, I doubt that this would be a consequence. Jeff, you call on people?
Is this working? Yeah. So, wow, there are a lot of hands. I can't see, yes, you, the mask, I can't. Oh, yeah, all right.
Yeah, so really interesting paper, Lucian, very sympathetic to the idea that managers might be self-interested in some ESG, maybe kind of window dressing. I'm wondering though, when you're looking at the way in which managers act when they sell the company, that they bargain for themselves and for the shareholders, wouldn't we expect the managers who are interested in other stakeholders to be the ones who refuse to sell the company? Because when the company is sold, typically you're going to have synergies, which means layoffs, right?
Yeah, sure. We've received this question both for the first paper and for this paper, and our answer is no. So the answer is, look, you are looking just at the greedy bad guys. The good guys are not selling. But, even if the people are good and they are good in the sense that they are stakeholder oriented, sometimes it's good to sell the firm because there is a substantial surplus created. But if you are stakeholder oriented, your job is just to make sure that the stakeholders, if there is so much surplus being created, the stakeholders get some of the surplus, so at least they are not made worse off. So if you look at the transactions during the Corona period, some of them had premia of 50%, 70%, 80%. Surely those managers, if they were stakeholder oriented, and they didn't get zero protection for the employees. They didn't even have provisions that say if you are fired, you get a gold watch or $10,000. All we are saying is if they were stakeholder oriented, they could have accepted 76% in premium and maybe gotten the gold watch or $5K as compensation for people that are being fired.
let's get some quick reactions and because we're running out of time. So Alan, and you're not going to respond. At the end, you get a chance, but Alan.
Well, this is friendly to you, Lucian. There is some law in the sense of LORE that companies in the 50s and 60s were pretty publicly oriented, but at that time, CEOs and boards received fixed compensation, and they really couldn't do any better by working harder. And so they not only went to country clubs, but they try to help the local community. So I think really it's I think you should focus maybe a little bit more on the change in incentives. We don't pay people like that anymore.
Brian.
This is just a comment to further your point of view, Lucian. So the stakeholderists are quite pessimistic about government action. They see it as glass half empty, or maybe 2/3 empty. But by my lights, government action has been incredibly effective at addressing social problems in our nation. So, like, take industrial pollution. The Clean Air Act of 1963, subsequent legislative amendments, action by the UP under it, had enormous welfare benefits in cleaning up industrial pollution in the United States. You could say to the stakeholders, point me to any action that emerged through stakeholder pressures that comes, close to the welfare benefits of government action.
In the back. Yeah. So yeah. Mike, please.
But Susan.
Oh, Susan. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Hi. So I think this is fabulous, really interesting. But I think one of the implications for social activists is that they have to work with government and with business. You can't have all these great things that Ryan is talking about, the government did, without some help from business to see that they'd be better off with some portion of business with some sort of regulation compared with grumpy consumers or whatever, right? And you're telling a depressing story, but I think that one implication of it is that it's even more important for the civil society NGO community to maybe refocus their direction, but to recognize that they have to have they have to bring some of the business community in with them to get things done at the government rather than just get everybody angry at everybody.
Two comments. Sharon, who gets the prize for coming.
Thank you.
9,000 miles. So
that's true.
And then Patrick, and that'll be it. And then,
So, Lucian, I remember from your own scholarship about executive pay, which we should celebrate separately one day, but that you mentioned that public rage is an important force that influences managers eventually. So if the world is indeed on fire, don't you expect that one day managers would respond and adopt ESG initiatives?
Yes, thank you. Very interesting work, Lucian, very interesting talk. And I'm going to go in the same direction as the last two questions. We shouldn't ask, is a stakeholderist firm potentially efficient? We're past that. I think that the key observation is what you put down in your slide that Rebecca Henderson made. We are in a world on fire. And everything's changed by that. And when your house is about to be burning down because there's a wildfire, of course, the more efficient intervention is the firefighters. But they're not there, the firefighters. So what do? You just do the best you can. It might be highly inefficient, but you have to do the best you can.
Thanks a lot. There are few and other were suggesting, where do we go from here? Right. So I agree that the world is on fire. And to take this analogy, your house is on fire. And you are saying, let's pull all the levers. And let's suppose you can call the firefighters. You can also take some cards out of the desk, or you can maybe start reading some middle-aged poetry about fires. And you can say, look, the house is on fire, let me do all three, can't hurt. And I'm saying, if we concluded that the firefighters are the only thing, let's throw the cards and let's if we didn't get them on the phone, let's run to the neighbors and call. Let's go to the payphones. Let's do everything just to get the firefighters. That's the first thing. I agree with Ryan that government regulations are not hopeless. But I think that that's connected to some of the comments that people made, that our success hardly depends. Susan said on getting business to help. But does business have the incentive to help? Some of the people who say we cannot get the government to do things is because they say there is so much corporate lobbying. But the funny thing is, they then they say, well, we can't get government action because the companies are lobbying against carbon taxes in order to be able to continue emitting emissions, but then they are hoping that the same companies themselves will solve the problem. So this is connected to Sharon. Sharon said, yes, there is an outrage constraint, but the way I think about it, Rebecca Henderson and everybody else in the newspapers, they are saying, the world is on fire, there's an outrage, let's do something. And Patrick said the world is on fire. And I think that the ESG rhetoric is weakening the outrage constraint because some of the people who are otherwise outraged are reading the newspapers and are saying, oh, I read that this company had just issued a net zero pledge for 2050. I saw there are those shareholder proposals. Hart and Zingales just wrote a paper. And other people, and I'm suggesting to put it, I'm saying any paper put on SSRM that suggests that the ESG is working on one way or another with this and that margin. You, the writers, and I'm all for academic freedom and for academic, and I enjoy reading those papers. But if you're asking practically, I think that each of those papers is creating on some small margin, Hart and Zingales' paper on a much bigger margin because many people read it, but it creates some sense that maybe private ordering will move us big part of the way. And if you accept our conclusion, which we think is not depressed, it's semi-optimistic, but it's mainly realistic. If you accept our conclusion that the ESG is mainly a rhetoric that is distracting, then anything that we can do to eliminate the sense of confidence that private ordering might move us part of the way, any of that can help us to get to the right place, which is to get the firefighters, in Patrick's example, to get to the house. Thank you.
So issue is joined on that issue. Next, we have a Zoom person. So Lisa Bernstein is in Chicago.
Okay, everyone. So what I want to do today is to share with you and invite you to contemplate with me the central finding of a study of contractual relations between large Midwestern integrated product manufacturers, my constant area of interest. These are firms like John Deere or Harley Davidson, and they're suppliers of component parts. So what's the finding? Well, the finding is this. In this particular market, there's a near perfect convergence between, on the one hand, the 18 core management techniques of intra-firm hierarchy that the World Management Survey has associated with increased productivity, and the long, often overlooked sets of contract provisions that we characterize as managerial provisions that are included in modern procurement contracts, though typically found in supplier handbooks and vendor agreements and things of this sort. Now, the managerial provisions I'm talking about are written and are part of the agreements. But like most aspects of intra-firm hierarchy, they're not really legally enforceable, at least not in any meaningful sense. Yet, unlike the 1960s, when Stuart Macaulay went out and looked at this very market and declared that contracts were typically put in the drawer, never ever to be seen again, these managerial contracts are read and understood by the parties, including the line managers who are going to implement them. They're fully integrated into the very detailed computer platforms that are used to manage the relationships. And they in fact have a very strong effect on parties' workday activities. In addition, in some ways even more important, when they are all implemented together, they create value that's much greater than the sum of their parts. That is, in addition to the effect that they might have on productivity, they also combine to create a contract governance regime that's really well structured to facilitate commercial cooperation, to strengthen the force of network governance, and to scaffold the growth of the types of trust that managerial scholars associated with enhanced firm performance. If you want to take a step back and view the finding just a little bit more broadly, what it really shows is that the governance structures that are created by these provisions, taken together with the many strange contract administration mechanisms that have been developed by firms to implement them, have evolved to a point where buyers are able to functionally replicate through contract most of the benefits that are associated with vertical integration without any need to vertically integrate. To me, this finding raises very interesting questions about the theory of the firm and might be sort of a first step towards an explanation for Adelaide, Horchescu, and Severson's 2014 finding that they reported in the AER, that the make or buy decision, at least as regards physical inputs, can explain only a fraction of the vertical ownership structure in the economy, including in important parts of manufacturing sectors. So to give you a sense of just how close the elements of intra-firm hierarchy and the terms of intra-firm contract provisions converge, it's useful to look at how each of the practices in the four main World Management Survey categories pictured on the slide are reflected in the managerial terms of procurement contracts. So let's turn first to operations management, where we see all of the provisions reflected. These contracts typically require suppliers to use lean manufacturing processes and often highlight the particular aspects of lean that the buyer considers most critical. They also require very exacting types of quality control and very particular types of work systems. These provisions are really important to buyers. They're so important that they don't just make the supplier promise to comply with them. Rather, they'll often send in their own teams of consultants at no expense to the supplier to train the supplier on how to implement lean or how to meet their quality control expectations on a more general level. The managerial provisions also contain numerous operations and quality control related rules that are designed to micromanage, and I do mean micromanage, the supplier's operations, and sometimes the operations of the supplier's sub-suppliers as well. These sorts of provisions will say where you source your raw materials. They'll dictate the exact placement of machines on the factory floor, sometimes requiring permission to move them as little as an inch. They'll specify the work instructions that you find at each station on the factory floor, and they'll specify the types of management provisions and positions that the supplier has to create. In the areas of target setting and performance monitoring, absolutely all of the World Management Survey practices are required by contract. The agreement set out numerous key performance indicators and describe how they're to be calculated. The metrics are tracked on the dashboards of the online contract management systems, and the same data is visible to both of the parties, typically in real time. Brad, you can put up a sample screen so those who haven't seen it get a flavor for just how extensive this information is. The contracts also spell out, again with great specificity, the consequences of a supplier failing to meet its obligations. And in this, they communicate what Bob Gibbons has called relational knowledge. This is done in part through a process known as the Supplier Scorecard, which isn't something very fancy. It's just like your kid's report card from school. It's a report that's given by the buyer to the supplier that aggregates information about the supplier's performance, typically on a quarterly basis, and then assigns the supplier a grade. Get an A, maybe you get more business the next quarter, or maybe you get superior terms. If you get a B, things are probably going to stay the same, but you know you'll be watched a tad more carefully. Get a C, and the buyer's probably going to cut the buy and might even require you to submit some sort of remedial plan showing how you're going to increase your score in the future. In these agreements, buyers also show a reluctance to rely on mere promising by reserving the right to use a wide variety of different types of boots on the ground monitoring techniques. These range from audits to plant visits to provisions which say our guy can be on the factory floor and supervise certain parts of the production process. It's really only in the last category, which is human resource and talent management, there's even the slightest divergence between managerial provisions and the World Management Survey practices. But this divergence is small, and it doesn't stem from the transactor's inability to contract along the relevant dimensions, but rather it stems from their intense fear, or at least the intense fear of their labor lawyers, of triggering the independent contractor rules. Yet even with the independent contractor rules sort of hanging over their head, buyers take an active role in these areas. They'll dictate key personnel. They'll require employee exchanges at many levels of the organizations. And sometimes they'll even say, hey, supplier, you have to appoint one of your supplier employees to be the buyer's champion within your firm. You have to appoint someone in your hierarchy to promote our interests. So when you sort of look at these together, and this has just been a short description designed to give you the flavor, what you see is that like all of the hierarchical management techniques employed within the firm, these provisions are really designed to give the buyer the authority to manage and monitor important aspects of the supplier's operation, and to do so pretty much as if the supplier were operating as a full part or subsidiary of the buyer's firm. Now, this is actually a pretty good thing. And the reason is that in these markets where the firms are operating, the move towards supplier-led innovation and the increasing endorsement of Japanese-style quality control techniques, which begin at the design phase and go through the product process, have really made it necessary for buyer and supplier employees at many different levels to work together and to do so as if they were employed by a single entity, something that the governance techniques that are reflected in these managerial provisions were designed to achieve. So with this description of managerial provisions on the table, I want to sort of take a step back and explore the ways that apart from their productivity gains they might lead to, these provisions and the devices that implement them have the potential to contribute to contract governance writ large. So let's turn first to cooperation and thinking a little bit about how these provisions can help create the very familiar conditions that support the creation and maintenance of cooperative contracting relationships. So an important precondition to the emergence of cooperation is that each of the parties begins the relationship by cooperating and comes in with an expectation that their counterpart is going to do the same. So in these markets, this expectation is created by something called the supplier qualification process. And this is a process that takes place before any agreement is signed. It involves the exchange of reams of information, plant visits, reference checks, and conversations between the buyer and supplier employees. The process is so expensive for both of the parties that neither really would have any reason to go through it unless they intended to begin their relationship with at least some degree of cooperation. This in turn helps both parties enter the relationship with a reasonable belief that the other one is going to cooperate. Now, once this cooperation is established, there are numerous other practices and provisions that are designed to reduce the likelihood that the cooperation will break down over some sort of misunderstanding or lack of clarity, task clarity that is, over what's to be done, or will break down because an act of intended cooperation is mistakenly categorized as an act of deceitful defection. So turning first to task clarity, the managerial provisions themselves are very clear, they're very detailed, and they're presented to the parties in a form that often contains numerous annotations and hypotheticals that are designed to let the party know exactly what's expected. But in addition to this, the firms take, the buyer firms that is, many steps to ensure that these provisions are understood. John Deere has webinars on the meaning of these requirements. Caterpillar University, run by the Caterpillar Corporation, has a university for its suppliers, and they have classes understanding CAT's terms and conditions, understanding CAT's welding requirements, things like this. And as I mentioned before, buyers also send their own teams into the supplier's plant to teach them how to do things. Now, in addition to this clarity, there are another set of provisions that are really designed to help to ensure that cooperation doesn't unravel because of misclassification. One key provision that contributes to this is known as the root cause provision. A root cause provision requires the supplier to undertake a structured inquiry into the reason that a bad outcome occurs, and then to share the results of that inquiry as well as the information on which it's based with the buyer. This lets the buyer assess, not perfectly, but better than if they were just guessing, whether a bad outcome was due to a mistake or an act of defection, whether it's something that's going to repeat or a one-off sort of thing, thereby reducing the risk of misclassification and reducing the risk that the relationship is going to unravel. Now, to further reduce the chance that these relationships are going to unravel, the buyers also go to great lengths to frame many of the most common things that can go wrong, not as breaches of contract, but rather as problems to be solved. So when a bad outcome occurs, you don't go and call the other person and say, you breached your contract. Rather, you send a polite little email called a corrective action request, where you kindly ask them to see to the fixing of this particular problem. And as long as the supplier solves the problem and this isn't happening as a sort of repetitive event, things just go along as normal. So together, these and a number of other managerial provisions have really created a framework that makes it possible for these relationships to endure over the long term and operate pretty much outside of the shadow of the law. In the words of Columbia, there's not a lot of braiding here. This is a regime of largely private order. So let's now look at the effect that these provisions have on network governance. As the slide, which I've shown many of you before, of Midwest procurement markets shows, The buyers and suppliers in this market are connected by a very dense and very clique-like set of ties, even when the only ties we're looking at are existing supply relationships. And of course, there are many more, ranging from little leagues to the Elks Club and things like that. When you're in this type of a situation, it's like being in a very, very small town. If you do something wrong in this type of closed network, that information is going to get out and be either known or knowable by everyone, and known and knowable quickly. So what do the managerial provisions have to do with this? Well, the managerial provisions in these contracts are not drafted on a contract by contract basis. They are just a set of standard form terms that are posted on the company's website for all to see. So as long as the network can transmit information about what was done, it's very easy for the recipient of that information in turn to know what the terms of the agreement were and to assess on their own whether that was compliance or non-compliance. So it's really this network and the speed with which it can transmit information about wrongdoing that replaces any shadow of the law in exerting discipline in this market and moving suppliers to actually comply with all of these many and very complex obligations. Now, I won't dwell on it here because it's not really the thing of this particular audience, but I will note that many managerial provisions have the effect of regularizing buyer and supplier interactions, okay, in a way that contributes to the creation of process-based trust, which is a very important part of trust in buyer-supplier relationships that's been documented extensively in the automobile industry. And the management literature has a number of papers which have really shown that process-based trust, that is sort of the sense that your counterparty is going to always respond in a clear and predictable way when something happens, is highly correlated with the growth of interpersonal trust and interorganizational trust, both of which have been associated with enhanced supplier performance, with the best studies, again, coming out of manufacturing markets, typically automotive, and certain electronics sectors. Now, with this view of the value-creating potential of managerial contracts on the table, I want to just put forward an important note of caution. And the note of caution is this: although the use or the non-use within firms of these practices has been found to explain 30% of the variation in productivity across firms, the question of why such helpful and well-known practices have not been more widely or indeed universally adopted continues to bedevil management scholars. And one very prominent explanation for the failure of these practices to be used by every firm is that their effectiveness within firms has been shown to depend very strongly on aspects of the relational contracts within the firm, contracts that can't be changed overnight and may be very difficult to modify. So this has a pretty important lesson for lawyers. And the lesson is that when they're going to incorporate these or other managerial provisions into commercial contracts, they're going to have to take into account that in order to predict or even understand how these provisions are likely to affect the workaday behavior of their counterparty, they're going to have to consider not just the terms of the agreement between the parties, which is the sort of traditional domain of transactional lawyering, but also the way that each firm is organized. They'll have to look at the organizational structure in the firm, the network structure, the relational contracts, and the culture within each firm, or they're really not going to have a handle on how what they draft is going to affect the real world. Now, the peril of ignoring this can be seen by looking at Honda's early experience trying to move its US-based suppliers towards lean manufacturing. They wanted to do this because it would make them more productive. But when you make someone more productive, there's always the risk, as someone noted earlier, that this is going to lead to employee layoffs. And Honda went and they did their whole full Honda number on US firms. They spared no expense, but it was not working. Eventually, the reason for this was identified as the workers were scared that the very moment the lean transformation yielded fruit, they would be fired. Once they understood this, Honda included a no layoffs provision in their supply contracts, sent the teams in, and what do you know? The transformation was much, much more effective. And I think that this example is one that really should sort of stand out to practicing lawyers and make them realize that if they continue to just look at the terms between the parties, rather than at the terms between the parties and how these terms interact with the internal hierarchies of firms, they are not going to be well positioned to draft optimal contracts. So with that, I'll open things to questions. I suppose this paper on some level doesn't quite fit the conference theme unless you would call it the ownership question mark of enterprise. So that would be the way I think it would fit into the themes we've talked about today, or perhaps it's just a quirky outlier. So with that, I will open things to questions, and I'll be joined here by my co-author, Brad Peterson from Mayer Brown and Platt, who runs many of their outsourcing practices and can give us a little bit more of a practical take on some of the issues raised here.
Okay, so we have 7 minutes for questions. And Lisa, do you want to call on folks, or shall I?
Go ahead. I can't see them for some reason. My screen has become very small. So
all right. So basically, so I can see the Zoom room as well. So Chuck, and then Victor.
Hi, Chuck.
Is that? I think that yes, that's on. So very interesting. This portrays the use of these new techniques as an extension of the hierarchy of the buying firm into the deepest interstices of the supplier, and I think that's very implausible, at least on the account that you give, for at least 2 reasons. I'll just mention 2. The first is
a little bit, Chuck. Did you say it's implausible that this?
It's implausible. Yes, I find it the idea that what's really going on here is an extension of the managerial hierarchy, so that the buyer completely controls the activity of the supplier. That I think that's the clear message of this, and I think that that's implausible.
Control everything, Jeff. It's that they could control these aspects if they chose to. The extent to which different buyers actually exert the control at different times is an open question that I'm looking at now in an interview-based study. This is what's reserved, the power that's reserved to them that they can and have successfully used. It's not saying that every buyer does this in every contractual relationship. So in one large buyer, for example, we talked to a number of their suppliers. And what we found was that there were certain provisions that were really, really important at the start of the relationship and were followed to the letter. And then as the relationship developed and trust came into being and the parties had a sense of one another's capabilities, those were not implemented on a day-to-day basis, although the fact that they could be implemented and had been implemented earlier continued to have an effect, sort of a deterrent effect. Like if you don't keep doing this on your own, then we're going to come back in and do this on the parties' action. So it's not that I'm saying that John Deere goes into every supplier and runs its plant.
Well, you didn't mention that during your talk, and what that would do was shift the interest from the initial regime to the regime that modifies the rules that were established ex ante. But let me make my point, and I think eventually you may want to modify your argument so that we agree, but it's going to take a bunch more modification along the lines that you just started, and I think the result will be a quite different characterization than the brief one you presented here. So two counter considerations. The first is that many of these supplier firms, as I assume you well know, are innovative. They make things not only that the buyer can't make herself, but that almost no other supplier can make. Yes. And for that reason, it's hard to understand what you mean, at least taken as read, when you say that the buyer is specifying the production process and basically all the details of layout, the management, and so on. Now, I understand there were qualifications mixed in with what you said, but the impact of the talk comes from that kind of assertion, a total extension of the buyer's hierarchy. And so the obvious confounding consideration is if I don't know how to make something and I'm dependent on my partner to produce it, I can't very well prescribe precisely how the partner goes about doing the thing that I don't know how to do. Now, there's an alternative interpretation of many of the rules that you mentioned, because you did say again and again, this is about quality, that's about quality, this is about testing, and so on. And that's true. You can easily imagine that there are, and not imagine, it's the case, as I think you'll agree, that there is extensive agreement on a very detailed quality control regime and procedures for maintaining it, and procedures to follow when it breaks down. But if we look at the breakdown procedures, we come to another consideration that cuts against the spirit of what you're saying. So when there's a breakdown, there is a root cause review. But the point of the root cause review is not just to find where the supplier went wrong, because many of the problems are jointly produced. They're the joint product of small errors committed both by the buyer and by the supplier. Think of what happens, the number of cases involving lithium batteries in e-vehicles. It's extremely difficult to determine where the problem originated, and I just use that as a limit case. It's not an exceptional case. It's the case that illustrates the general problem, that you could imagine a buyer and a supplier agreeing on all of these extensive procedures that would, on your reading, be completely lopsided and intrusive for the purpose
I didn't say that they, I didn't say that they were intrusive. I'm very careful not to say they're intrusive, because I'm actually of the opinion, okay, that sometimes managerial inertia of various types prevents the supplier's firm from doing what's best for it. And that sometimes these contracts actually enable supplier firms to overcome that inertia. So that's not something that I'm saying. I mean, you've read the underlying paper, so you know I'm not saying that.
Well, wait. Could I suggest that Chuck and Lisa have a good occasion to meet on Zoom and all right. No, that was terrific. And thank you very, very much. And look, one of the great things about this event is we run out of time to say what all ought to be said, but we need to move forward. And so, Josh Mitz.
So it's wonderful to be with you all this afternoon. I am going to talk about yet another patron of the firm, And this is the group of folks who borrow shares of the firm. We're going to talk about securities lending. And so I'm going to begin by discussing some motivations for why we might be interested today in securities lending. Although the topic of securities lending and short selling goes back a long time, there's some new innovations. We're going to talk about 3 questions in connection with securities lending. Who pockets the cash? What are the implications for systemic stewardship? And what are the implications of securities lending for shareholder welfare in the broader sense? And maybe I'll save this for the Q&A, we'll talk about some policy solutions. So it's already been discussed. Oliver at lunch talked about this. BlackRock on October 7th announced that beginning in 2022, institutional clients can direct the voting of shares held by index funds. A little noticed footnote buried at the very bottom of the announcement is that BlackRock will determine eligibility criteria under this program based upon, quote, financial considerations, including the decision to lend securities. All right, so for those who don't know, when a large institution like BlackRock lends its securities, it is not able to vote those securities. It has to recall the securities. There's a sort of really fun, we can go deep in the weeds with that if you want. At some point, it's a repo transaction. Henry's written about this in the empty voting literature. And so we are in many ways, I think you're seeing the continuing impact of securities lending programs, and lending shares to short sellers who are borrowing shares today is a very important source of revenue for the funds industry. And I'm going to come back to that and give you some data on that. Just a week before, the SEC proposed a rule on proxy voting and proposed to amend that for purposes of the disclosure, the mutual fund disclosure. Basically, the bottom line is that mutual funds need to disclose the volume of shares that are on loan to short sellers. Why is that important? Because until this proposed rule becomes a final rule, we simply do not know for any given fund how many shares it did not vote because those shares were on loan. So this is sort of emerging as a policy issue that the SEC is focused on. The third motivation is GameStop, which I've said jokingly to my students gives kind of a perpetual stream of topics to discuss. This is not GameStop 2021. This is actually GameStop 2020. So GameStop was giving fodder for papers even a year and a half ago. And the story of GameStop circa 2020 is that the large institutions in a proxy fight in 2020 owned 43% of GameStop. But it turns out the share lending rates were extremely high for GameStop leading up to the record date. And in effect, we saw ex post that those institutions only voted around 5% of their shares. And we also see in the securities lending market that there was a jump in the fraction of shares available for lending in the case of GameStop from 17% to 40%. So what does this tell us? Taken together, these institutions lent instead of voted. They made their shares available for borrowing because the short selling demand was really high. All right, question number 1, who pockets the cash? So the big question in this area we don't have a very clear answer to is how much of an investment advisor's lending fees are retained by the advisor. So industry sources have reported that BlackRock retains about 25 to 28% of securities lending revenues. Here, I'm reminded of Lucian's comment from earlier that there might be important heterogeneity between the fund families and the advisors that are out there. Vanguard swears that it returns all of its lending revenues back to the funds. We'll think about this a little bit more in just a second. The claim that's made by all of these large fund families is that they offset a substantial fraction of their ETF management fees and index fund management fees via the income received from securities lending. BlackRock, for example, says 79% of the management fee for the iShares Russell 2000 ETF was offset by securities lending revenues. Of course, that is a different question from how much the advisor retains. Yeah? And in fact, the ability to attract clients to a fund is a function of the net fee that those clients pay. So one can imagine, yeah, that there is probably some link between the fees that are charged to clients and the securities lending revenues. If the competitive rate is 10 basis points, well, you can kind of rig things in such a way so that you end up charging your clients 10 basis points, which means we shouldn't put too much weight on this 79% number. Rather, the question that we should be asking is what fraction do the advisors receive? We don't have good disclosure. We're getting industry reports and it's kind of bumpy. It's not very clear. So in a paper with Eddie Hu and Haley Sylvester titled The Index Fund Dilemma, we look at a change in August 2019 in the SEC's guidance on securities lending. So basically, prior to August 2019, the governing interpretation of the law was that funds basically had to cast their shares in the best interests of fund clients. So if they felt that there was a proxy vote coming up where it was in the best interest of fund clients in this almost fiduciary sense, if you will, that they should have to go ahead and recall those shares, taking them out of the share lending market. In August 2019, the SEC issued guidance saying, well, if the lending fee is high enough, it's a cost benefit decision that you can evaluate. It's a trade-off that you can make. That is to say, you can consider funds and fund families whether the opportunity cost from pocketing those lending revenues might be such that it would be better in your view for your clients not to recall your shares. In this paper, we use that shift in the interpretation of a fund's fiduciary duty as a shock to measure changes in this trade-off between voting and lending. So what we find is, and what this picture is showing you, is average supply in the 10 days leading up to the record date of a corporate vote. We think that this effect is likely to separate among firms based on index fund ownership. The idea is that firms which have high degrees of index fund ownership are more sensitive, if you will. Their investors, those funds are more sensitive to lending revenues. Simply the idea that if you're an actively managed fund, you're going to be less dependent on securities lending revenues because you're trading in and out, whereas the index funds are buy and hold and leave the shares in to be lent out to borrowers. What we see in the data is that following the SEC's guidance, there's a jump on average in the supply of shares that are made available for firms with high degrees of index fund ownership. And so this is consistent with the story that we saw with GameStop, that after the SEC said you can trade off, you can make this judgment that it would be in the best interest of your investors to not vote. In fact, funds started doing that, at least some on the margin. Now, why should we care about this? Well, Bebchuk and Hurst have shown us that large institutional investors, especially the passive index funds, have weak incentives to engage in governance because of their low expense ratios. By contrast, share lending revenues are captured entirely by the fund, or this should really say the fund family. Some of those revenues are retained by the fund manager, creating an additional agency problem of the kind that Lucian pointed out earlier today, that we have in effect now an incentive to pocket some of those revenues. And as I said, it's unclear whether those revenues actually lead to a reduction in expense ratios. What this poses is a kind of free rider problem, and that if you recall your shares to vote, there might be only a chance that you're going to affect the outcome. And you're trading off that uncertain choice to recall your votes, and uncertain in the sense of the value creation from the decision to recall votes. You're trading that off against the certain lending revenues that you're getting by having your shares out there on the share lending market. I do a little bit of a back of the envelope calculation as to how large this incentive problem might be. And I think that the magnitude is sufficiently striking that even if you disagree with some of these calculations, it would have to be off by a couple orders of magnitude. So let's see let's see what we've got. Llewellyn and Llewellyn in a recent paper show that the average institutional investor gains an extra $129,000 in annual management fees if a stock holding increases 1% in value. By their figures, you can work it out in one of their tables. That means the average institution in their sample owns about $7 billion in exposure. Of course, this is highly skewed. This is an average, not a median. Suppose the annualized lending rate is 0.1%, which is actually fairly high in many cases. So that would be about 7 million. You can do the math. It works out to a break-even point between securities lending and increasing firm value of about 1.84%. What I'm saying is that an advisor which succeeds in pocketing more than 1.84% of those lending revenues, in this toy example, would prefer lending securities at an annualized rate of 0.1% over increasing firm value by 1%. Again, you can quibble with the example, you can quibble with the assumptions, but the magnitude of the incentive problem is quite stark, and that's because of the share of those lending revenues coming into the fund family. Remember that BlackRock, by industry estimates, is pocketing between 25 to 28% of its securities lending revenues, which is at least in order of magnitude terms, creating a powerful incentive to lend securities at the expense of firm value. Why else might we be concerned? Reason number 2, does securities lending undermine the incentives for systematic stewardship discussed by my colleague, Jeff Gordon, Jack Coffey, Madison Condon have weighed in on this as well. The basic idea with systematic stewardship is that diversified investors have an incentive to vote in a way which reduces portfolio-wide externalities. We've been discussing this all day. Borrowers of securities, however, are short sellers. Now, the key idea here is that we often think of short selling as being an act that's focused on cash flows. It is a bet, a negative bet on the firm's cash flows. But it turns out that Slava Foss has, and his co-author, have identified that there is a premium to the record date. So on average, stock prices will fall not by very much on average, but in some cases, as much as 5% when they go ex vote. So there is a premium that's attached to the record date. And they interpret this premium, this price decline, as activist investors in some cases willing to pay a premium to accumulate those marginal votes before the next meeting. So what does this imply? Well, the question we should ask ourselves is whose votes are those activists buying? So it depends on who's selling to them, right? Now, if there's existing shareholders who are selling to them, those are probably actively trading. By that assumption, they're unlikely to be our large passive investors who are lending their shares. But it could be that the activists are buying from short sellers. And if activists are buying from short sellers, then what they're effectively doing is selling large institutions' votes, because what you've got is institutional votes being in effect, you've got institutional shares being lent out on the share lending market, and you've got demand coming from activists and others who want those votes before the record date. This is in effect a kind of new form of empty voting, a la Hue and Black. In effect, the idea here is that short selling can operate not only on the cash flow dimension, but also on the voting dimension. So you can, in fact, have an expected return. If you think of that 5% X vote decline, that creates an incentive to be a short seller. You can come in and capture some share of that 5% decline. And we have very little work today on the relationship between the price of shorting a stock and the price of voting, if you will. So what do we know about the prices at which activist investors are willing to pay to, in effect, acquire the votes of institutions that short sellers are selling to them, right? Because the idea here is that as the demand increases, those lending rates are going to go up and up and up. As those lending rates go up and up and up, the BlackRocks of the world will not recall their shares, right? They'll pocket those fees, even, by the way, if they give a large fraction of those fees back to their shareholders. Notice what is happening is that there is a divergence between how BlackRock might vote those shares and how the buyer of those shares in the secondary market will potentially vote. This divergence can manifest in a number of ways. So you could have undiversified activists out there paying a premium because they are looking for an idiosyncratic gain, or they have an idiosyncratic view on this company. And who is selling to them are in effect, are diversified investors selling their votes. Those diversified investors might be voting in a systematic way, as Professor Gordon has suggested, but in fact, the voting now is changing. Last point, shareholder welfare versus cash flows, as Hart and Zingales here have shown us, there could be, in fact, yet a third problem, that subjecting proxy voting to financial considerations inherently exchanges cash flows for other determinants of shareholder welfare, like pro-social preferences. Think about an investor who has taken the time and effort to express their views, a fund client. They may not agree with the price at which BlackRock cashes out their vote. So even if they're getting a large payoff, if you will, from the share lending market, that price might be the wrong price. We've talked earlier about the information problems. Jill and others have talked about the information problems that large institutions face and the extent to which they may not be well positioned to bargain for their shareholders' pro-social preferences. There could be, in a sense, a kind of agency cost there because, again, they're pocketing some of those revenues. It would be troubling to just discard clients' expressed preferences. I'll wrap here by saying there's little evidence that lending rates adequately compensate clients for taking away their pro-social votes. We have very little evidence on that. I'll pause here and open it up for Q&A, and happy to talk more about policy.
Let me take moderator's prerogative to start you with a question, and that is, it sounds like one of the suggestions, empirical suggestions of your work is that we should see the activists having a greater degree of success after the change in the SEC guidance, because on your account, it's easier for them to get additional shares, additional votes, et cetera. So do you have any evidence or a strategy by which you might get evidence to show that the guidance change that you suggest maps onto the real world of the activists, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. We wrote this paper in 2020, so we had all of one proxy season following the rule change, and even then, practice in the industry was just starting to shift. So I think the answer, Jeff, is not yet. We might need one or two more proxy seasons so that we can get some good data. I think you can generalize Jeff's point, not only by looking at the success of activist campaigns, but just asking more generally whether corporate voting has changed after this SEC policy change. While we have lots of data on lending, because we have, lending active in vigorous lending markets for every security, we have less data on highly contested proxy contests, highly contested corporate votes. Those don't happen anywhere near as frequently. So we need more data, I think, before we can say this is actually changing the outcomes in proxy fights. The GameStop example suggests it might, but we don't yet have strong evidence on that.
Lucian, Roberta, Victor.
Yeah. Just a comment on the normative dimension, and that probably will apply to the policy. In a way, you are saying the index funds, when they sell the votes, there is an agency problem at the level of they can't vote for their own beneficial investors. But that kind of implicitly assumes that if they had a vote, they would vote in a way that would truly serve the interest of their beneficial investors. When I look at your data, and being a skeptic of the stewardship by the big three, I think that the world is actually somewhat better off in terms of stewardship and perhaps even beneficial investors. For example, if you assume, and that's the take of that I accept and others, if you think, for example, that the index funds are more differential to corporate managers than others, and then what would be good for their own beneficial investors, and then when they don't vote, it's in a way agency problem, but given that they have agency problems in voting, the world might paradoxically become a better place on the margin.
Yeah, so that's great. And we don't really take a position in a welfare sense as to who's less conflicted, right? Which is, so we could have an activist who by buying the index fund vote is ultimately value enhancing. But I think the point is that there's a preference divergence, right? So, if your prior is, closer to Jeff's, that we want large diversified investors voting because we think they do care about systematic considerations, then you might be more trouble. If your prior is that activists are kind of doing something and these index funds are doing very little, it's closer to, or they're in the pocket of management. But in any event, the question that I think we need to ask is that market working? Right? We don't really know anything about that market. We know very little about, what the situation is from a short selling standpoint. We would say short selling is competitive, but we're thinking in terms of cash flow, who has the best estimation of the cash flows of the firm. We know very little about who's selling, who's brokering votes, and what it looks like on the institutional side.
Roberta.
So this is somewhat related, but I have some data for you from an older paper. But I would say that in your paper, there's an assumption that the ones who are lending would vote differently from the ones who are borrowing, and that's not clear. But there's an older paper, I went to check the years, 2007, by Christofferson et al. I was mentioning it to Joshua before, but I went back to check on their data. But they actually looked at vote trading, big jump before the record dates, particularly on companies where there was like a merger or things coming up. But they found actually that in those, so I think this is something you can do. You don't have to go to Jeff and looking for the change in the rule. All you have to do is look at companies where there's a lot of vote trading and those that aren't, that have proposals to see if there's a difference. Their findings were that the ones that there was a lot of trading, it corresponded to support for shareholder proposals and opposition to management proposals. And I think that their thesis about this was that they thought this was a good thing because it gets to people who are more informed, because those are the people paying for it. Now, that may not be true, right? Because then you're saying there's a divergence, but I think the gist of it is one has to sort of say why you think there's a divergence, who's more informed. And again, then this goes back to whether, how you think these, we think that votes should matter, but I think you can do a better job. You don't have to, as I said, you don't have to wait another proxy season.
Right.
We know who the firms are that are trading. We know what, you can even just look at things like voting for directors or saying a bunch of things that you could look at to see if it matters. So I think that would be
a great point.
useful.
And the motivation for using this 2019 policy change was a causal motivation. It's we wanted to say, all right, so when we change this trade-off, what happens in the market? You're absolutely right. So there is a literature, and it's this Foss and Holderness paper is not the first, and I'm glad you brought that up. There is literature showing that there's trading. I think the sort of novelty here, or the difference is in asking about the supply side. So it's one thing to come along and say, well, we demand because we're informed. Yeah, very, 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 very well. But in a systematic stewardship framework, we think that it's actually a good thing that those who are voting are not voting on idiosyncratic information, because we think from a portfolio maximization. Right. Great. Yep. We should go there. Thank you.
Victor.
I'm a little confused. Seems to me that if the activists succeed, the stock price goes up, and that screws the short sellers. So why are short sellers selling to activists? It seems to be not in their interest. Am I missing something here?
Sure. So if they were certain, right? So what's happening in a lot of these cases, like even in the GameStop case, you couldn't know how many institutional votes were going to be. So, sure, if the activists, I take your point, Victor. If the activists have rational expectations and the short sellers are going to be around, if you're selling the day before the record date, if you're shorting the day before the record date, you can be out of your short position. You don't really have to be around. You don't have to wait around even for the outcome of the vote. You don't have to wait to see what happens to the proxy fight. In effect, the point is really, it's two distinct pieces of information. It's two events. One is just the supply and demand phenomenon, that the votes have value. And so as a short seller, there's a market to be a broker there because and this is really the institutional friction actually coming out of Hugh and Black. Because you would think, well, why would short sellers have an effect, a kind of lock on the institutional votes? That's because the institutions, after being criticized for empty voting, said we're not going to lend solely for the purposes of voting. So the point is really that the short selling market is the only way by which a buyer can acquire at least some of those institutional votes. That's a supply and demand story. Right after that goes X vote. As a short seller, you can cover because you've supplied what the market wanted. You don't have to wait around to see what's going to happen to the company in the end.
Hugh.
Yeah.
So complex and wonderful presentation, great analysis. I really liked it. One presumption in terms of these questions and presentation has been in the sense that whoever has the votes has the incentive to make things better. But of course, there's empty voting, with negative economic interest, right? That is that, and Christofferson never thought about that possibility. Hers was a very early paper in 2007 or so. Never thought the possibility that you might want the votes to destroy the company, right, to vote Mickey Mouse to the board,
right,
that sort of thing. And that has happened, concretely demonstrated.
Yeah, it's a great point. And the use of derivatives here is also, so you can be buying these shares while you're net short, via a swap or options position. So absolutely. Yeah.
So John and Jill, one after the other, and then you respond.
Why don't we focus on index fund ownership? So my view is that all we talk about the subtle differences in terms of when index funds and active managed funds. It's a mirage because they're all really collectively in the same fashion by the same funded. Running rather than I think it shows very little differentiation. Also, I don't think that the turnover in active managed fund portfolios is so significant that they're likely to want to liquidate the security of the security everything. So why don't I just consider ownership by all?
Jill.
So normative story. Voting is a second order effort to discipline firms. And there is work, there's a PhD student at Wharton that you referenced. It is a paper looking at supply by passive funds in the lending market with respect to trading, not just voting. And I think it's worth, it's also supply side, so it's related to the issue that you're thinking about. And he's looking specifically at the passive funds, these passive funds lend to a greater extent, so it also justifies your position.
Thank you, and I'll very quickly say I have a second paper which looks at pricing by the large institutions. I may have already cited it, but I want to see what you sent me. I think it's a fascinating question, John. You're absolutely right. So we're not suggesting that this only happens with index funds, and you're absolutely right that the voting is unchanged. In fact, that's one limitation with using the design in this paper in the way that maybe Jeff was suggesting, because we don't think necessarily that the voting policy is going to change. We think recall behavior will change. Okay, so here it's a portfolio argument that the actively managed fund on the margin is going to be cycling in and out of securities at least marginally more frequently. The index fund that's buy and holds, it's at rebalance primarily or fund flows. So for the index fund, the securities lending program is much more important. They're much more likely to be responsive to this trade-off. But maybe we can talk more after about this. Yeah.
Okay, so all right, Patrick, question.
Yes. So, Josh, very interesting. My question is specifically to borrowing for the purposes of acquiring a vote. So, most votes on most proposals are lopsided. So if you want to change the outcome, you really have to borrow massive votes, a massive stake, right? And so presumably, if you're going to borrow to vote and therefore change the outcome, you're really going to look at proposals that are forecasted to be very close. Is that something you can check in your data?
So Henry's shaking his head. I think I think our intuition is shared. So I agree with you, Patrick, that this should be strongest in a sense. In the case of this effect, this trade-off should be the strongest. The vote should be most valuable when the margin is close, when it's a swing state, if you will, right? When it's a close election. Agree completely. That being said, I think the equilibrium effect of this is a little more complicated. It's a little trickier, right? Because presumably the blocks that are accumulated to swing a vote one way or the other are done so taking into account the incentives of those lenders. And if in the case of GameStop, you can rationally suppose that only 5% of the vote will be exercised by those institutions, it may ex ante change your strategy.
Okay, so thank you. So John Morley is a very brave presenter. John, the floor is yours.
So now that I'm at the end of the day, there's really two strategies here. One would be to be very brief. One strategy for me would be to be very brief. The other would be to tell lots of jokes and stories. And I'm going to try to do just a little of both. So with my colleagues' indulgence who've heard this story many times, I just want to say something about the very first time I visited Yale Law School. When I was a junior at the University of Utah, I came here to New York to visit the woman who was then my girlfriend, now my wife. And for some reason that escapes me now, I decided to visit some of the law schools to which I was thinking about applying. I came here to Columbia, where people said a bunch of rude things to me. I'll tell you about those later. I also went to NYU Law School. And then, of course, I got on the Metro North to head out to New Haven to visit Yale. When I got on the train, I remember looking across the aisle, and there was a very distinguished gentleman there reading the Wall Street Journal. Now, this is very impressive to me, having grown up in the desert of Utah, that somebody would read a paper as prestigious as the Wall Street Journal. So I kept an eye on this gentleman. And he pulled open his laptop and sort of typed for a bit, but mostly he looked out the window and went to sleep. And when we got to New Haven, I stood up, and because these were in the days before smartphones, I looked across the aisle and said, "Could you please direct me to Yale Law School?" And he said, "Yes, I have a rough idea of where that might be. In fact, you can get in the taxi and ride over there with me." And while we were over there, he introduced himself as none other than Henry Hansmann. And while we were in the car, I said, "Well, what do you teach at Yale Law School?" And he said, "I teach organization." And I had two reactions. The first was, "What on earth is that?" And the second reaction was, "Wow, that sounds incredibly boring." The most important part of my interaction with Henry, though, came right as we exited the station. And those of you who've been to New Haven Union Station know that right in front of where you exit the station, there's a lane where the taxis pull up and a little crosswalk that goes right in front of the taxis. And right as we came out of the train station, there was a very large woman holding an even larger cup of a fountain soda drink, the kind with the big plastic cup and the straw coming out. And as she's walking across this crosswalk right in front of the taxis, a taxi pulls forward and stops, and it almost hits her. She was understandably very upset. She says a bunch of words that I can't repeat. And then she winds up and takes this bottle of soda, or this cup of soda, smashes it all over the taxi windshield. There's Pepsi flying everywhere, people screaming at each other, the taxi driver screaming, she's screaming, people gawking. Henry regards this scene with his customary scholarly detachment and says, "Welcome to New Haven." I knew right then that was the city where I wanted to spend the rest of my life. So ever since then, I've been strongly inspired by Henry and his example in his work. And consistent with that, I've decided not to present a paper to you about a publicly governed company, but instead to look into something weirder and more wonderful, and I hope perhaps even a little more interesting, which is this strange phenomenon called the directed trust. I've written this paper with Rob Sitkoff, who, as you all know, is really into trust law for reasons I can't quite fathom. We started, let me say, before I tell you what a directed trust is, I want to convince you that it's an important phenomenon. Rob and I first started drafting this article in about 2012. And back then, there was a lot of practitioner interest about it. In fact, by then, about 35 states had adopted statutes specifically to address the phenomenon of directed trusts. Nevertheless, there was essentially no scholarly writing about it. And I'm sad to say that to this day, there remains no scholarly writing about it. And the reason is Rob and I got diverted. We tried to do something very un-law professor-like, and we decided to actually try our hands at writing the law. So beginning in about 2015, we began work on the Uniform Directed Trust Act. And like all uniform statutes, this statute was drafted by a committee. And the chair of that committee was none other than one Rob Sidkoff. And the reporter on that committee was none other than one John Morley. And we learned a lot from the committee. We're deeply grateful to the committee for all that we came to see. But the final version of the statute enacted what we understood to be our theoretical understanding of this phenomenon when we first began writing about it back in 2012. I'm proud to say that the statute has been moderately successful. It's been adopted in 15 states since 2018, including, and it's been proposed in 3 more, those are the ones in blue, including the state in which we now stand. So we hope to make 3 contributions in what someday we believe will be a paper about directed trusts. The first is we want to answer 3 questions. First, what is a directed trust? Second, why has it become popular? And third, what should the law do about it? Let me begin by explaining what a directed trust is. In a conventional trust arrangement, we're talking here about donative trusts rather than business trusts. A settlor wants to make a gift to a beneficiary, which is the box at the bottom here. But rather than making the gift outright to the beneficiary, instead the settlor vests title in a person known as a trustee. And in the course of vesting title in the trustee, the settlor provides the trustee with a series of powers, which include, in addition to the power to hold title, the power to invest the trust assets, to distribute the trust assets, and to administer the trust assets. Now, a trust director comes in at the top here when the trust director gains the power over the trust. And who is a trust director? Well, in the practitioner literature, there's a great deal of confusion about this. There's a wide variety of terminologies. There's investment protectors, distribution advisors, trust directors of various kinds. And the way Rob and I define it is simply to say a trust director is any person who holds any power over a trust who is not a trustee. This was the general definition adopted by the Uniform Directed Trust Act. Now, what differentiates a directed trust from a mere conventional trust, of course, is that the trust director can be given all sorts of powers, investment, distribution, and administration. They can take all sorts of exotic forms, including, for example, the right to remove the trustee. There is, however, one power that cannot be taken from the trustee, and that is the power to hold title. Now, some of you may know, but many of you may not, that a common law trust is very different from a corporation in the sense that it has no independent juridical existence. There is in the common law, technically speaking, no such thing as a trust. Instead, what there is a trustee who holds property for the benefit of beneficiaries in trust. The result, once again, is that the title to the trust property is in the name of the trustee rather than the trust. And this creates the following conundrum that Henry wrote about many years ago in a paper that foreshadowed his important work with Rainier Crackman on entity shielding. He said that the problem you have in a trust is that if the trustee goes personally bankrupt, the trustee's personal creditors would ordinarily be able to seize assets of the trust because the trustee holds title to them in the trustee's own name. The most important and foundational feature of trust law, therefore, is a property-like rule of asset partitioning that says when a trustee holds property in trust, the trustee's personal creditors may not seize it. This is a property-like rule, as Henry explained in that early paper, because it applies in rem even against people who did not agree to it. Therefore, we can't remove title holding from a trustee because were we to do so, the personal creditors of the person who held title would be able to seize it. Indeed, possession of title in this way is part of what defines a person as a trustee. So then the question becomes, well, why has this strategy of dividing up responsibilities become so popular? We have, as with all decisions, of course, there's an array of costs and benefits, and settlors seeking to establish trusts weigh them in an optimization problem. The benefits are as follows. Basically, settlors set this up in order to exploit differences between trustees and trust directors. And there are 2 categories of differences. The first is differences in ability. Trust directors might simply be better positioned than institutional trustees to make decisions about the management of a trust. For example, if I hired Bank of America to be my trustee for the trust for the benefit of my substance addicted child,
Well, Bank of America might be very good at doing accounting and filing tax returns, but they're going to be very bad at assessing whether my son is behaving responsibly. And so instead, I'm going to appoint my Aunt Ruthie or my brother or my wife to be a distribution director with the power to make decisions about whether my son gets the assets or not. Similarly, a trustee might not be very good at making investment decisions. So rather than having Bank of America invest the assets, I might instead hire BlackRock to do it. Another set of differences involves differences in the application of legal rules. Now, you might say, we live in a society governed by the rule of law. The law applies equally to everyone, right? Well, wrong. Actually, depending on particular individual characteristics, the law might apply differently to a trustee than to a trust director. For example, a trustee might be in one jurisdiction and a trustee in another. Say, for example, I live in the state of New York and my trust director is in the state of New York, but I want the application of Delaware law. What do? I appoint a trustee. I appoint a trustee who's domiciled in Delaware and then give directorial authority to my trust director in the state of New York. Additionally, in many states, well, every state, not every financial institution can serve as a trustee. There's financial institution regulation governing service as a trustee. So I might appoint a non-trustee financial institution like BlackRock to be the investment director and a trustee financial institution to be the actual trustee. Now, of course, there are costs. We know this because not every trust is a directed trust. Among the costs are drafting costs. Also, there's an increase in the total administration. When you have more cooks in the kitchen, even though there are efficiencies to dividing up responsibilities, still sometimes the total costs can be greater. There's a third and more interesting cost, which is consistent in an interesting way with work that Henry's done previously, which you can't see here because of this box, but there's conflict. A directed trust has a greater potential for conflict. Let me show you a slide that illustrates why. Not only do we have conflict potentially between a trust director and the trustee, but we also have a potential for conflict among the various trust directors. And indeed, the potential for conflict is even more acute than the potential that's animated Henry's work about ownership. Because in Henry's work about ownership, he points out that there might be a group of collective decision makers who make decisions together, such as, for example, the shareholders of the firm. And Henry points out the high cost of having heterogeneous interests among that group of collective decision makers. In a divided trust, in a directed trust, things are even worse because these people don't even make decisions collectively. The powers can be divided up and granted separately to different trust directors. So for example, one director can have power over investment, another over distribution, and another over administration, and they don't exercise them as a single unit. So for example, there's an important case in New Hampshire in which a distribution director showed up, or rather a trustee with power over distribution showed up and wanted to liquidate some assets in order to make a distribution to one of the beneficiaries. And the investment director, they were a group of the settlers' sons who were running a family business. They said, no, we're not liquidating anything. Get lost. And as a result, no distribution could be made. It's a fascinating conflict and one that could only be resolved with careful engagement with the instrument. So the last question is, well, what should the law do about this strange and unique animal? And Rob and I have some ideas. But before I get there, let me say, conventional trust law has a lot of trouble dealing with this phenomenon. And the reason is, under conventional trust law, the entire law of trusteeship attaches to title holding. This creates two problems. First, it's too easy on directors, because what it means is that the trustee is a fiduciary, but the directors are not, notwithstanding the fact that they exercise all sorts of powers in what is plainly a fiduciary capacity. It's also too hard on trustees, because the law will hold a trustee responsible even for powers that the trustee does not possess. The trustee might not hold title, but not the power over investment, for example, and will still bear fiduciary liability for investment. So what Rob and I did in the Uniform Directed Trust Act was to impose basically three reforms. The first was to attach the law to each power individually. And to be precise, we attached the law to powers, not persons. Many of the state-directed trust statutes make a mistake in which they apply the law to investment directors rather than to powers held by investment directors, which makes them confusing and difficult to parse. A second innovation Rob and I introduced was to apply the law of both fiduciary and ancillary law. Every state-directed trust statute addresses in some fashion or other, however ham-handedly, the problem of allocation of fiduciary duty, but there's a whole other body of laws. in the law of trust that has to be addressed as well, such as, for example, the laws governing trustee removal, trustee appointment, trustee succession, trustee posting a bond, and so on. So Rob and I basically solved these problems by taking the law of trust and applying it to a trust director. We didn't reinvent the law of trusts. Instead, what we did was say, whatever the law of trusts happens to be in this state at the relevant time, that is the law that applies to a trust director to the extent appropriate. Let me just say a couple of words specifically about the allocations of fiduciary duty. We say, of course, that the duty belongs primarily to the person who holds the power, not to the person who holds title. We also said that a director bears the same duty as a similarly situated trustee, and that the duty of a director is waivable to the same extent as the duty of a trustee. And lastly, we say a trustee, I will say among the states, there's a variety of solutions to the problem of a trustee's duty, right? If a director holds a power over investment, should the trustee bear duty over that? One answer is to say no, none at all. Another is to say a trustee only bears a greatly diminished level of duty. The reason some states preserve a modicum of duty for a trustee is because the trustee ultimately holds title and therefore almost always has to be an accessory in some fashion to anything done by a trust director. If I give an order about investment, it's the trustee who's got to sign the order carrying it out. So in the Uniform Directed Trust Act, we followed the formula adopted by Delaware and said a directed trustee is only liable for actions that constitute willful neglect, which is a very tough standard for a plaintiff to satisfy. The second thing we had to do was to address the problem of coordination and conflict. Recall the one here. We reached two conclusions. First is there's no possible way we can resolve all of these conflicts. Directed trusts are simply too varied for us to come up with a standard form solution. However, we did require that trustees and directors have to communicate with each other regarding matters that are within their overlapping ambits. Lastly, we reconciled the law of co-trusteeship with directed trusteeship. Basically, we made it possible, we overrode a bunch of previously existing mandatory rules to make it possible for settlors to create in co-trusteeships where trustees collectively hold title together. We made it possible for settlors to recreate in those arrangements many of the same allocations of fiduciary duties and other rules that one could create in a directed trust. Do we have time for questions? Okay.
Let me just start by asking, your measure of success is the number of states that have adopted the statute, but do you have any sense as to the number of lawyers that have adopted the form? Because it does seem, as you were suggesting, that you could draft a trust conventionally with trustees that shared power among themselves as specified in the trust, without the extra burden perhaps of a brand new form, a directed trust with all of the legal issues that litigation we need to resolve is a tough case. So have lawyers in fact adopted the form that you have enabled under the statute, or is it, to what extent has it disseminated as a useful form as opposed to a theoretical form?
So I can't say how many people have adopted trusts under the Uniform Directed Trust Act, but what I can say is that the directed trust has plainly become far more popular than co-trusteeship. And indeed, that illustrates part of why the statutory reform is necessary. The law of co-trusteeship contains mandatory rules that prevent the reallocation of fiduciary duty in the way that I've just described as being possible in a directed trusteeship. You cannot relieve one co-trustee from the obligation to monitor the fiduciary conduct of another. But you just can't do it. It's a mandate. And so part of why we had to reconcile the law of co-trusteeship with the newly created law of directed trusteeship was to abolish those old mandatory rules and create greater flexibility.
If this question makes no sense, I apologize. It reflects my ignorance of trust law, but I'm trying to map the problem. Trying to map the problem, the problems you and Rob are analyzing into where they might manifest in corporate law, what we all know about, or at least what I know a bit about, and I don't know even a bit really about directed trusts. And so we know that the board of a corporation, they're fiduciaries of the corporation. They have under the statute the legal authority to manage the business affairs of the corporation. They often, almost always, certainly in a public corporation, delegate that authority to a great extent. And we know that the officers, quote unquote, that they delegate to are also fiduciaries of a corporation. The officers also delegate their authority to a great extent. Doesn't this show up? Doesn't the set of problems you guys are analyzing ultimately show up at some point in the corporate form? Since after all, the assets of that entity are being managed by a bunch of folks, in some sense, down the hierarchy, that are not fiduciaries, that are outside of the set of norms, legal norms, the corporate laws evolved that are meant to address various conflicts and so on and so forth. I'll stop there because,
Yeah, so delegation is not unique to corporations. It also occurs inside of trusts. There's a doctrine in trust law that governs specifically the delegation by a trustee of some of the trustee's powers. So if I'm, for instance, Northern Trust Company, and I need, for instance, to sell a piece of real estate, I can hire a real estate agent to go out and do it. And by so doing, I've delegated some of my powers. And here again, there are mandatory rules of trust law that impose upon the trustee certain unavoidable fiduciary duties with respect to that delegation. And those mandatory rules are more or less analogous to the rules that we find in corporate law. If the directors of the corporation are negligent in selecting the CEO, well, they're potentially liable for that negligence. Now, to be clear, corporate law has the business judgment rule, which greatly minimizes corporate fiduciaries' liability for the misdeeds of their inferiors. Trust law is much more demanding. In trust law, the duty of care is quite serious. The standard is truly negligence in trust law. In a directed trust, by contrast, the trustee and trust director may bear no liability or only a greatly diminished standard of liability for one another's misconduct. In other words, a directed trust allows a settlor to reduce a trustee's fiduciary liability far below what the trustee's liability would be under an instance of mere delegation, as well as co-trusteeship.
In the back, yeah.
Right. There was a time when the American Law Institute basically monopolized uniform lawmaking. Is what you do now common? Two smart guys say, "Hey, let's make a uniform statute," and then become intellectual entrepreneurs independently of Ricky Revesz, who is the head of the ALI right now. And how could could that be abused?
Well, it's an interesting question, Bruce. I was afraid when I talked about my involvement in drafting a uniform statute that I might get murdered by Alan Schwartz and Bob Scott. I'll also say that when you voted on my tenure case at Yale, Bruce, nobody even knew that I had done this. It's a tremendously undervalued thing in the American Legal Academy today. But look, I'll pitch it for all of those who might have an ambition to do it. I learned a great deal doing this. It was really satisfying. And honestly, of the many things I've done in my career, the Uniform Directed Trust Act might be the thing of which I'm most proud. I think the only thing of which I might be a little bit prouder is causing the entire SPAC industry to hate Rob Jackson.
So I mean, if I get your story, it's really the point of the directed trust rule is to change the liability standard of a co-trustee. That is to say, you have somebody who under one state of the world would be a co-trustee, but basically that's too expensive to have such a person. So you essentially set up an alternative form, an LLC, we'll call it, in which you limit the liability of a party who provides a service to the trust, which otherwise would be under a more stringent standard of the duty of care in the service provision.
Yeah.
So it's 102B7 for a trust. Well, I
don't know. I'd have to think about the analogy of it. But yeah, it's an interesting contrast. And let me say, a lot of co-trusteeships are also awkward because it's just difficult to have multiple people owning title to an asset. It's just administratively complicated. So it's much simpler to have a single title holder and many people funneling instructions through them. Notwithstanding, of course, I mean, I guess the efficiencies there have to be balanced against the additional conflicts created through this framework.
Okay, well, I think, there's a question? Who is asking?
Yes, Sara.
Oh, thanks. So I just have a question about the design of the trust, and particularly this idea of having the multiple directors with different powers. That sort of separation of power structure seems to invite, and the potential for one to sabotage the efforts of the other. They're basically just a bunch of veto gates, it seems. So my question is, can and why not just have like a super majority requirement or a unanimity requirement? If the directors are to take any action, just require all three of them to agree, rather than separating these powers. I guess the question is, like, what is the benefit of actually separating them versus just having a higher threshold for approval of any trust action?
One of the things that really excites me about trust law as an area of organizational structure is that it's so enormously flexible. It will allow you to do all sorts of things that are either brilliant or stupid. You have the freedom to do whatever the heck you want. And so, look, sort of in some circumstances, it might be quite sensible to collectivize decision-making. In others, it might be sensible to fragment it. And trustees do both. And let me say, the Uniform Director Trust Act provides specifically for the possibility that the powers of a director could be exercised collectively, just like the powers of a corporate board or the powers of a group of co-trustees. You can do that, and some people do it. I mean, here's an example. A very common form of directed trust is one in which some rich guy funds a trust and makes it revocable up to the point that he becomes mentally or physically incapacitated. And he appoints a committee that consists of his wife, his daughter, his son, and his doctor, who collectively have the authority to declare that he has become incapacitated and the trust has become irrevocable. There's an instance in which the powers of a group of trust directors are exercised collectively in precisely the manner you just described. And the terms of it, we provided by default in the Uniform Directed Trust Act that their decisions would be made by majority vote, but one could certainly provide that they would be done by unanimity.
So that is a vigorous way to end the session for the day. So thank you.